What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 3 of our full story of Divinity Original Sin. So, last episode, we left off by finding exactly who killed Counselor Jake, and we also picked up a couple leads exploring the larger plot behind his murder, and basically all the things going on surrounding that, and all the suspicious stuff going on with the cult that we have been running into whilst investigating this murder. Now, last episode, we mentioned that the next thing we were probably going to do is try to track down Baracus Rex's tomb and basically stop the cult of Immaculates that we mentioned earlier from resurrecting Baracus. To that end, we need to explore the eastern side of the map. Now, this is where the higher level enemies are. There are a couple things we can do before we jump straight into the church where we believe Baracus to be buried. So, if you do a little exploring, there is an imp trap workshop we can explore, and on the other side of that we can run into one of the minions that has been raised by a mysterious necromancer that has been causing the undead problems. His name is Diedrich. As it turns out, he is actually the old general of Baracus's armies. Now, I mentioned this guy because from this conversation we can actually learn that a necromancer has been resurrecting people with the intent of resurrecting Baracus Rex. So whoever this necromancer is that's doing this is directly working for the Conduit and trying to further her goals for some secret that Baracus apparently knows. That's all things we can learn from this conversation. Another part of the map you can explore is actually a burning ruins near the churchyard itself that is actually caused by one of the undead abominations that has been raised that is called the Twins Joined by Fire, which is basically just a fire monstrosity. It doesn't talk, there is no dialogue to be had here, but it's just another one of the minions that's been raised. You can kill it, move on. But being optional, you can actually just completely ignore this one if you wanted to, but killing it for the XP is of course recommended. Now, the last thing I want to mention before we actually get to where Baracus is being held is that there is a small hut just north of the area in which we fight Diedrich. So this particular hut is important because if we arrive here before we go to the church, we can either pick the lock or destroy the door and avoid a few traps to read a bunch of notes from none other than Thelrion from the village, the healer from the village, that is. So these notes and things explain a ton about Thelrion's kind of backstory and what his goals were. So it turns out that the healer in town is actually also working for the Conduit, but not so much as a subservient person, if that makes sense. So Thelrion had enough intelligence to realize that while the Conduit is definitely not the prophet she's masquerading as, he understands that she is still very powerful and that he has things he can learn from her. Because Thelrion's goal, from reading these diaries, we can find out, is to give a true second life to his love who passed away, Malia. Now, while Thelrion has been dabbling in necromancy and has thus discovered the power of the bloodstones that we mentioned from the last episode as well, on his own, he also knows that he doesn't know enough about them to give someone a true second life, which is considered the ultimate power of the bloodstones, really. Because up to this point, all he can really resurrect is like skeletons and things. And basically, we read from these diaries again, the Conduit and Thelrion came to an agreement that basically the Conduit would give this information to Thelrion if Thelrion could find and raise Baracus Rex from the dead in order to learn what Baracus knows about breaking a soul forge, which is, of course, important. But the specifics on why we'll get to a little later. So that's all information we can find totally before we go to the abandoned churchyard. Once all that's wrapped up, I recommend actually doing any quests or anything like that, side quest wise, leveling up that you can do around the area first, because the fight with Baracus is difficult. He's kind of like the main boss of the first area of the game. And after we kill and defeat him, eventually we'll be moving on to Luculla Forest, which was the other lead we received after dealing with Evelyn and Counselor Jake. That being to head to Luculla Forest and track down the White Witch Akara. But before we get to there, we are at the churchyard. So you actually have to walk around the church in a clockwise fashion in order to reach the entrance. So you're basically walking through a graveyard, and yes, you can totally dig up all the graves. There's actually a quest or two involved in that, mostly just involving unlocking some chests, and then there's like some ghosts you can talk to, for instance, that kind of thing. There is a fun fight in the middle of this graveyard where you have to fight the crazed graveyard caretaker, and he summons a ton of exploding skeletons who will do crazy damage to the oil and poison barrels all around them and cause just hilarious explosions. It's a fun fight. It's not meant to be difficult. Like, truth be told, if you sneak up on this guy and kill, just hit, ignite one of the barrels that he's standing next to, you can kill this dude pretty much immediately. But it's just kind of a fun fight that kind of explores some of the mechanics that are used by Divinity Original Sin's combat system, so it's just kind of a fun little thing you can do. I've always enjoyed this fight personally, always gotten a good laugh out of it, so I wanted to mention it. But once we've had our fun in the church graveyard and we've made our way around to the entrance, upon clicking on the door, we are immediately stopped by the statues actually on the outside of the door. Now, I actually do not like this interaction personally, because they explain that only people who are dedicated to the Immaculate's cause basically are allowed inside the church. They test you on your knowledge of this because they can tell you're not part of the Immaculates just by looking at you, apparently. And the part I don't like is the question they ask you, you as a character would know the answer to, just fundamentally. It's the conduit. Basically, they just ask who the prophet is and what does she go by in her pursuit of whatever goddess it is that the Immaculates actually worship. So, to this end, it's like my two characters, any two characters up to this point in the game, like unless you came to the church first before you knew any of that, that would be the only time you don't know it. But even if we've dealt with all this other stuff first, we know the conduit's name, we can't just tell these guys it's the conduit. We roll a persuasion check that the game uses, and it goes off of that whether or not you succeed, which I just don't think, it's like I know empirically what the answer is. Why can't I just answer it? So I just think that's kind of a strange interaction I don't really care for. But 9 out of 10, you're going to wind up fighting these guys. They have a high defense stat, as you might imagine, being statues, but they're not super hard. You can usually beat them with no problem. But that brings us to the inside of the church, where we immediately run into none other than the conduit herself and several of her immaculate followers, clearly having killed several people in this desecrated church. But basically from this conversation with the conduit, we can learn that obviously she's planning on resurrecting Baracus, but more importantly what her larger goal with the cult of this immaculate religion is actually going for, which is essentially oblivion for all of Rivellon in the name of peace. Like basically saying that if everything is dead and gone, everything is inherently at peace, which is a twisted way of looking at things, but nonetheless that's her goal. So, from here, she runs off down below to presumably resurrect Baracus, or, talk to him or do whatever it is, but she disappears down below. So from here, what we can do is, of course, kill her immaculate followers, and then in Thelrion's hut as well, we actually learn the secret of how to open the altar back up where she disappeared to, because she disappeared down the stairs and then locked the altar above the stairs behind her. But if you picked up the notes in Thelrion's hut that I mentioned, you can actually find out that all you got to do is click on the portraits around the room, revealing 4 buttons. Click those 4 buttons, and then it will unlock the door down below. So once we get down below the altar and actually explore a little bit, we run almost immediately into Thelrion, who explains his side of the story. Again, if we found all of these notes and everything, we should already know most of the information he talks about. But more specifically, he likes to tell you about what it is he was trying to ascertain from Baracus Rex. So the whole reason he was trying to resurrect Baracus Rex was to learn how to break a soul forge. Now this is incredibly important to Leandra, otherwise known as the Conduit, because she is actually soul forged to her twin sister Ikara, and they are 2 very different people who are trying to accomplish 2 very different things, and being soul forged to each other is a real hassle for them. Now, if you don't know what a soul forge is, basically they can feel each other's emotions and wants. Perhaps more importantly, if one of them dies, so does the other one, which, as you can imagine, for 2 people who do not share the same goals at all, it can be quite the hassle. Now, Baracus Rex is considered one of the couple of masters of Soulforge magic, and he apparently knows a way to break soul forges permanently. Now, this is the whole reason, of course, that Thelrion was trying to resurrect Baracus Rex, an endeavor he ultimately succeeded in. However, Baracus Rex being the Source King, the tyrant, like the literal, as far as brutal tyrants go, he's the pinnacle. There were literally wars waged to kill this guy, which is the entire reason the Source Hunter Academy that we belong to exists. Armies were raised to kill this dude. As you might imagine, when Thelrion asked Baracus what the secret was, Baracus wasn't inclined to help because he's a terrible guy. And he just killed Thelrion outright. Well, mortally injured him so we could talk to him, and then he died. Now, in the next room is none other than Baracus Rex. So, We can talk to him before we actually fight him, of course, which isn't a huge surprise. So basically, he tells us much of the information we already know. He was resurrected to Leandra with her Soulforge problem. He pretty much knows that's what she wants. He flat out refuses to help because he's the Source King, and he doesn't have to, basically. Most of his conversation is telling you about how he died, even, so if that's something you're interested in, it's pretty cool. He does not like the fact that you are source hunters, but he also, like many of the more demigod divine beings that we tend to keep running into, can tell immediately that you two are more than just source hunters, as has been stated to us several times by a couple different people at this point. That's really all the unique stuff he has. He doesn't really tell us anything we don't already know. Just kind of goes into detail about what Akara wants, just his perspective of things, really. And lastly, if we mention Cassandra, because Arhu mentioned Cassandra to us, to Baracus, he explains that Cassandra was his sister and that Arhu and his sister used to basically serve him, which was many years ago. That's pretty much all we can learn from him. From here, it's just a fight. So he summons the 3 undead lieutenants that you can find around Syseal. 2 of them I've mentioned, Diedrich and the twins joined by fire. There is another one called the Ghoul that guards the lighthouse that I didn't mention specifically until just now, but he summons those 3 to fight. But the real problem you're going to find with Baracus is that he starts the fight, if you're too close to him, by casting a level 15 spell called Meteor Strike that at this level on tactician mode even can just straight up kill your whole party. So basically the easiest way that I've found to do this personally, and that several guides actually recommend doing, is send one person in to talk to him and initiate combat, and then immediately rush back to the doorway leading into his room. And for whatever reason, Baracus himself will refuse to actually walk down there to the doorway, but all 3 of his minions that he just summoned will actually swarm the doorway, making them easier to kill. So you can kill his minions and then deal with him separately, just because for whatever reason he refuses to go past a certain point in that room. So that's probably the easiest way to deal with him if you happen to be having trouble. So there you go, guys. That is how to kill Baracus Rex. But, however, we are not done yet. Once we've killed Baracus, looted his room, gotten, all of that done, and we head back to town, we are immediately met by Arhu, who expresses his great relief that Baracus Rex is finally dead. Again. So, Arhu goes on to explain his side of the story, that yes, he did used to serve Baracus Rex because he was friends with Baracus' sister, Cassandra, who was apparently a sweet girl who had, just barely turned 18 when they met. I don't remember if I mentioned up to this point or not, but Cassandra and Baracus Rex were actually soul forged together, and much of the experimentation Baracus did on finding out how to break soul forges was due to this specifically. Now, because of this, obviously Baracus would never kill his sister Cassandra despite being a huge tyrant, so he would basically just torture Arhu and Cassandra whenever he felt like it. Was kind of more what was happening. And at some point, Baracus decided, in order to, one of the ways apparently that you can break a Soul Forge is to turn one of the persons in the Soul Forge into a lich. Apparently that just breaks the spell by the nature of the lich never being able to die. So Baracus forcibly turned his sister Cassandra into a lich, and using this happening, Arhu actually took the opportunity to escape his sort of imprisonment between Baracus and his sister. And according to him, he never really looked back, though he always felt sorry for Cassandra, of course, because once this happened, she was never really the same afterwards, as you might imagine, because she had just turned into a lich, and they're notoriously bloodthirsty. So that is Arhu's side of things. Once this is dealt with, again, we only really have the one lead, and that is heading up to talk and find and talk to the White Witch Akara in the Luculla Forest. But before we wrap up this video, in killing Baracus, we actually find another Starstone in his room. So this unlocks another room for you in the Homestead Hall, otherwise known as the End of Time. And this particular one gives us the last Starstone we need to get the first piece of the Source Hunter's history, because again, it's mentioned that they are more than they appear to be.
New portion of history appears to us for the first time in not even I know how long. Let us look together. Let us see what the Weaver has woven.
Long ago, 2 great generals led mankind in a terrible war. The dreaded Void Dragon threatened all of existence, and man and gods alike joined swords to stop it. The two generals were celebrated as the rulers of all, and even the gods paid them tribute.
And as the cinematic will have revealed to you, the two source hunters we're playing used to be generals of great renown, in none other than the war against Baracus himself. And in fact, they did such an amazing job during this war that they were basically made leaders afterwards of this empire, or whatever it happened to be considered at the time. And that's the little bit of history we can uncover, again, as the cinematic has of course shown you at this point. That, guys, is where we're going to wrap up this particular episode of the full story of Divinity Original Sin. Next time, of course, we are going to start exploring Luculla Forest to the north of Seal, and seeing if we can't track down the White Witch and what that entails, so we can learn her side of the story and some more information on what's going on with the Cult of the Immaculates. Because as Arhu himself puts it, we have foiled one of the Conduit's plans, as she was very clearly interested in breaking the Soul Forge between her and her sister, but whatever the Conduit's larger plot is to hasten the void, shall we say, has yet to be uncovered. With that, guys, I'm going to leave you. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.